right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Briefing Room. And first of all, I can't miss an opportunity to promote the world's first made-for-TV webinar series, Future Proof. Check your local listings. We're in Silicon Valley. We have our own time slot in Washington, D.C. We're in Atlanta and Kentucky and Los Alamos and lots of other places on real actual televisions. How cool is that? So you can also search on YouTube for Future Proof to see recent episodes. So let's dive right in. Divide and Classify, Conquering LLMs for the Enterprise. The Briefing Room, we're going to talk to a couple experts in the field. Andrew Ahn is, he was the guy who headed up Apache Atlas. We'll maybe just talk a little bit about that, but these days he's the founder and CTO of PraxyData, doing some very interesting work with ontologies and LLMs. Of course, yours truly is here, and Dr. Robin Bloor himself is in the house. We'll be hearing from him. So first of all, one of our attendees, or regular attendees, sent me an email the other day about this show and made some incredibly interesting observations. And he talked about the criticality of ground truth. And by the way, that image right there is from a video. And if anyone wants to see it, send me an email. I'll send it to you. It is one of the most shocking videos I've ever seen. That is a Russian soldier who was approaching a trench in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian got the better of him on that occasion. That's right before that guy went bye-bye. So ground truth is this concept in the military that basically says this is what's really happening on the ground. Sure, the news reporters may be telling you that there's no fighting in this region, but I'm on the ground and bullets are flying over my head. So that's ground truth. And what his point was about these LLMs and the hallucinations in particular, he said, we have to give these models some axioms. He said that the computer has to start with true truths, and it cannot be allowed to pattern recognize its way to the truth, which of course is exactly what it's doing. These large language models consumed tremendous amounts of text. I mean, just absolutely massive amounts of text, but they also consumed formulae and spreadsheets and all kinds of different things. And when you work with them, when you give them a prompt, what it's really doing is reflecting back to you based upon a pattern recognition analysis that it's done of the text in your prompt and the syntax, and it's trying to predict what it thinks you want to see. Now, they do have this issue with hallucinations, and we'll probably talk a little bit about that. But in essence, as another friend of mine says, Eugene Burke from Digital Strategies Group, he said the problem is that these LLMs have they don't have an epistemological barrier. So they don't know what they don't know. And when that happens, they just create something. And I even had the go-to-market guy for ChatGPT on Twitter when I was covering the Databricks conference a number of months ago, chime out. He was upset that someone at Databricks said something he didn't like. They basically said, oh, be careful about sharing proprietary information and when you use these tools. And he came out and said, oh, we don't do that. You know, we don't do that. And I used that opportunity to ask him, what are you doing about hallucinations? And his response was, remember, that's more of a feature and not a bug. In other words, these things are designed to be generative in nature. But what we've now seen in the last 5 or 6 months is a tremendous amount of innovation in trying to augment these engines and trying to mitigate the hallucinations. We're going to talk about RAG, the model that came out of Facebook that is really designed to give some ground truth, or as the embeddings are referred to, anchors of truth. And I love that concept. So embedding strategy is really, really important. And I think embeddings going forward will be the way that you do train your models. And I also talk about how training these models is a lot like training or raising your kids. You wouldn't want to take your 2-year-old and drop him or her off in some gangster's house where drugs are being dealt. That's not a very good idea. It's going to have a different kind of embedding than you probably want. And for those of you who have raised kids, you will know that whatever is around them will get absorbed by them and then reflected back to you. So things like bad language or bad manners, these things get absorbed by kids because their brains are just sponges and they're just sucking all this stuff up, and that will reflect back at you later on. So it's very important to be very careful about how you train your children and how you train your large language models. And Alex Husky also pointed out that Alan Turing was only able to crack the Enigma code after providing it some ground truth. Apparently, there's a good scene in the movie about that. So I thought it was very interesting and a very, very good point. Right now, they are pattern recognizing and you have to curate. So how do you do that? Are you going to boil the ocean and curate every last thing? The answer is no. So you need a real solid embedding strategy to train these models. And I predict that every enterprise is going to have their own proprietary version of one of these models. They're going to pick their poison, either Bard or ChatGPT or Anthropic with Claude, I think it is. They're going to pick their poison and they're going to start training. And that training process is really, really important because I don't think you can untrain too well. So Dr. Robin Bloor years ago wrote the Algebra of Data, and Alex said, hey, maybe this could be a foundation for training LLMs. So could it save us? It is a very valuable look at the algebra of data. So of course, algebra is a discipline. It's a mathematical discipline. It also reminds me of Ludwig Wittgenstein when he wrote Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And he basically defined mathematically everything that can be said, and then got to the end of the book and as kind of a smart aleck said, all right, everything I've just said, forget about it. Don't worry about it. It's all nonsense. He was kind of kidding, but he made some really interesting points. And I can tell you from memory, he actually denoted all of them. 6.4311. He wrote, death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death. Then he said, if we take eternity to mean not infinite temporal duration, but timelessness, then eternal life belongs to those in the present. Well, I heard that and it blew my mind. I mean, I remember reading about that years ago, reminded me of a scene in Breaker Morant, which was an excellent film. If you haven't seen it, it's hard to find. It's about the Boer War. And one of the characters, I saw this when I was like 9, watching cable TV. Two of the characters are going by these dead bodies. And the one guy says, funny thing about the dead, they don't know they're dead. I was like, oh, what? I've never stopped thinking about that. I'm like, wow. So anyway, I'm throwing these out as sort of philosophical points to absorb and to realize that we're at a very significant point in the evolution of mankind, quite frankly. This is not a small incremental change that we're seeing. This is a sea change. And personally, I think these LLMs have every last bit of enterprise technology in the crosshairs. One of the smarter people I know was saying that, yeah, you can actually train one of these models on your enterprise data warehouse and then just feed it the updates. In other words, it'll absorb everything in your enterprise data warehouse, and it'll know everything that's in your enterprise data warehouse. So it's like, well, what does that mean for data warehousing? Short answer is I don't know, but I can tell you that all kinds of use cases, especially customer service, especially frequently asked questions for products and manuals and things of this nature, these engines are ridiculously powerful, and they can absorb huge amounts of text and then summarize for you. And then you can just train it, say, no, give me more on this, give me more on that, and it will. I just as a quick example, the other day, I took a screen scrape of all the companies that are sponsoring or exhibiting at CES, the Consumer Electronics Show. Did a screen scrape, just Control A, Control C, went into a Google Doc, into a Google spreadsheet, Control V, got a bunch of messy text, and then I Control A, Control V into Bard and said, Bard, please strip out only the company names and give me an alphabetical list. Enter. And it went and just gave me my perfect ordered list, alphabetically ordered list of all the companies. And I said, now add a second column and include their Twitter handle. Just banged it all out. I was like, wow. It would have taken a good ETL programmer, an hour or two probably finagling around with this stuff to be able to do that. It took Bard seconds and it was done. That is the power of these engines. That's just a random ETL script. It does all these other things too. Now it does hallucinate. We got to work on that, but I'm telling you, this stuff is big. It's huge, and it's really redefining information architecture. I did a webinar last week talking about data warehousing, enterprise data warehousing, and things like joins and what a pain in the ass it is to do joins, inner joins, outer joins, et cetera. It's fairly costly for your warehouse to do that sort of thing, but the LLMs don't care. They have 2.3 billion vertices, some of these things, so they can view the world in lots of different ways. But again, they are just reflecting back what they've absorbed, what they've seen, and what you've trained them on. But as I think about it, I'm pretty sure that this slide is going to say it all. Your data too will be assimilated. These new AI models are going to dominate just about everything, whether it's how you persist your data, how you analyze your data, how you do queries. And as my friend, his name is Lou Simon, by the way. I'm trying to pitch them on a series called Simon Says, because he's a very smart guy. But he was saying too, it used to be that we had to speak in computer language to talk to computers, but we don't have to do that anymore. That's a huge change. Now you can just speak in natural language and talk to computers and get it to do computery things, which is a pretty freaking big deal. And with that, I am going to say that you should always bring in the big guns. Don't do it yourself. I'm going to stop sharing and let Andrew on take it from here. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. Wow, that was quite an intro. Let me start sharing.
Doing my best.
Yes. So like many others, we're working on a Gen AI product as well. It's quite evolutionary for us in terms of what we've built thus far. So this is actually a really great opportunity for us in terms of our objectives or missions. So just real quickly, what do we do? What's the name of the company? It's PraxyData, and we're really focused on data curation and automation. And obviously we'll change this very soon when our product is released early next year in 2024. But the idea is to base a lot of the output on enterprise data that they actually have, right? It's not a large language model that's been trained in the internet. It's actually trained on, your data, your company's data. So in that way, we feel that we can provide more accuracy and we can provide more relevance, right? So as I mentioned, we want to be the curation leader. We want to make sure that we can provide this functionality for basically all the tools in your data stack, right? It's a foundational element, right? Understanding your data and being able to access it, whether it's programmatically or through user interface, that component of it, that additional intelligence that Gen AI can provide should be available to people and all tools, right? That's really what we want to do. And we're not trying to be general purpose. I think, as you mentioned earlier, Eric, for the enterprise, they have very specific goals, and they need to go very deep into specific use cases. So we align to that. We don't want to boil the ocean. We want to, boy, that's really overused. We got to come up with another saying for that. But we really want to be focused on a specific use case, whether it's insurance, property and casualty claims, or health insurance claims, or something like that. And we really want to go deep. I think only in that way can we focus and get more efficient LLMs. The 7B, Llama 2 is just too large for many purposes. It's not as portable as we would like. So the only way to do that is to maybe not have all that stuff in there and put some interesting things back in it and specialize it for that use case. And that's really what we want to do. Obviously, the benefits are manifold, and we don't need to talk about that. That's already been done. It's already pretty much talked about all over the place. So we collaborated, and Dr. Bloor helped us with the previous book, actually, which I suggest you take a look at. But we really talk about some of the enterprise challenges. So we laid out the problem space. And so from that research, we really thought about, what we would want to put in a solution to kind of address some of the things that you talked about: hallucinations, being able to operate efficiently, and really provide a force multiplier, make those data workers, give them more superpowers, and remove some of this burdensome, maybe error-prone work that they currently do, right? And so, we deal with things like correctness, data leakage, and something that's interesting that you made me think about is this other item, which is data sizes. Just some simple math, you actually can't put all your enterprise data in Gen AI because at some point it's going to have to write something. And there's a kind of a rough rule around metadata and data. You don't want the metadata to be as big as your data because then you just double your gigantic data stash. But what percentage is acceptable, right? And at some point, the more functionality you have, you create this tool that in and of itself is burdensome, has care and feeding requirements, and becomes more complicated than the point that you started with, right? So really what you want to do is build your solution around the data that you have, but be really efficient about it. And I think that's going to be part of the trick. Enterprise data is not going to get any smaller, right? It's only going to grow. So how do you do this in a sustainable, scalable way? And what happens if you have to do actually really big, operations? You have, 100 million rows of transactions, which is quite possible for an online enterprise. And then you have, a reference list of 50,000 customers or 500,000 customers or 1 million. You just can't simply do that through a garden variety, publicly available offering today. So what we want to do is provide a solution that actually can handle that. And that's not an easy thing to do. Other things kind of under the covers that enterprises and regulated groups have to worry about that maybe small to medium-sized businesses and other industries don't have to worry about are things like a more rigorous security requirement and chain of custody, being able to pick apart and show how some of this logic was performed, responsible AI, white box technology versus black box technology, especially if it's used in terms of any kind of scoring, financial scoring, or any kind of assessment of risk. Those things are very sensitive, and it really requires to be able to prove that and have that lineage, right? And that's really going into the governance oversight. So without going through every one of these items, which I kind of already covered, there's quite a few areas that are specific to enterprises that are being solved, but are not yet solved today. So these are really important. Right. So a couple of things that we're working on that I think, basically the whole industry is going to is really these targeted LLMs, these customized, specific, use case specific LLMs for those use cases. And also collaboration. Right now, a lot of these efforts are done solo, right? We really want to have a good way to collaborate and not have this mob of various conversations competing with each other. We need to have a way to collaborate and have authoritativeness, right? Being able to publish in an orderly manner inside of an enterprise, put the appropriate people doing the appropriate checks for that collaboration. Right? Obviously, we need to do non-structured data, but the interesting thing that I think that's going to start to come up is the ability to take a lot of non-structured documents, forms, conversations, and then be able to relate that to structured documents, customer databases, histories, transactions, and being able to come up with real-time synergetic insights. Whether it is a co-pilot talking to customer service, or if it's something that deals with larger marketing campaigns or security programs or regimes. I think that's something that that might be kind of a neat benefit that we don't really anticipate, and that could actually end up being quite powerful because it might not have a lot of the showiness that you can do with some of the non-structured stuff. I think that's where we might really hit the pay dirt for enterprises, right? Where we might really impact the bottom line. The other thing is these regulated industries. My time at the NYC Euronext and others, other customers, really require just a bulletproof, unquestionable ways of protecting customer data or proprietary data. Those are for higher stakes, especially in regulated industries and finance. The penalties are not just reputational; it could actually be like criminal or big civil penalties. So the stakes are very high, and we need tools to really mitigate those risks in a proper way. And the only way to do that is to have these LLMs inside that firewall, right? Your VPC, on-prem, wherever you may have it. You really need to be able to wall that off. So those are the areas that we're working on. So right now we're off and doing this effort because curation right now has been and currently is terrible, right? It's very expensive. There's a lot of training required. There's a lot of tools required. So this, we feel, is the missing link. And the tools that we're providing, and I think the whole industry is providing, is really going to address this specific issue. the current strategy today is not sustainable. Even if you buy automated tools, they're general purpose, and just that last 100 meters, not even the last mile, that's really causing the problems today. We've built these really great tools, but they're still not easily usable. You can't hit the ground running for a lot of these use cases right away because they are general purpose, right? We feel that you need to have very specific use cases, so we create libraries, model libraries, and LLMs specifically for things like Accord for insurance, Bloomberg for finance, CPT for healthcare, and for the DoD, perhaps MEPRS codes and other privacy concerns. And it really allows you to do a lot of other things more authoritatively with less risk, right? So those Gen AI products being able to identify risk and opportunities because of that curation at scale, right? It turns out 80% of data workers spend their time just looking for good data, and that is just wasted time, right? So if we can collapse that just to a fraction of that, we can either double the productivity or double the speed in which they can do their work, right? And there's a whole host of scenarios around synthetic data creation and data protection that is just better if you have proper curation classification. And that's really where we think the interesting parts are. Maybe it's a little bit under the covers, but I think this is the critical element to this next stage. So basically we have this foundational stack that we're building, and we're kind of teasing at this because we're going to have a big reveal next year. So we have the enterprise dynamic profiling that's really smart. It's going to do it at scale. It's horizontally scalable, vertically scalable. And then we have our pre-trained use cases, as we said, and then we're going to also include those specialized LLMs that we talked about. And then lastly, you can do smart things with them, right? You can automate a lot of these things, either by publishing, a set of workflows, conversations, but that's really where we want to be. We want to automate the mundane things that are error prone so we can free the data worker to do really important, things to actually move the needle and the bottom line, right? All right. And so one of the things, and I'm not going to talk about all of these, really it breaks into like three components. We have to have a digital fingerprint. These are facts that we can trust and rely on. They're calculated, they're repeatable and provable. There's a semantic meaning, and this is where the training really comes in, and it's really important. We need to have understanding of the thing that we're classifying. Not all data is the same. In fact, it's quite different, and you need to treat them appropriately. And if we do those two things, we can do this third box, which is the automation that we talked about. And that's really where we pay dividends, and that's where we want to be. We want all the stuff to happen automatically so that you can get the fruit, the payload, which is this automation, right? And that's really what we're driving for. And I think it's the right solution for the enterprise, right? Okay. So the last portion that I want to talk about are some interesting structures that that really become available with automatic curation. I mean, we covered a lot of stuff, and I gave you a quick thumbnail, but a peek into what we're doing under the covers. But one of the really cool things that we're working on are these derivative objects. So if we have something like a customer, which is a semantic term, something that businesses know and care about a lot. Customer, it might be represented by a first name, family name, which is a synonym of last name, a purchase, and a product, right? They actually bought something, so they're a customer, right? Although your documents or your database or your JSON file in S3 doesn't actually say customer, an analyst would be able to look at that and know their customers. Likewise, the tooling that you have to do that classification should be able to do the same thing, right? So we create this derivative metadata object called customer, and we label it that way, right? And now we can attach and ascribe all the things you need to with customer. You need to protect their data, but maybe this customer is a good fit for different campaigns. And in that way, we build more intelligence, and we actually build that intelligence and attach it to the data, not the application. And the benefit of that is that all applications and all users can get that information, and it persists. The average data worker may not stay at a company very long, Applications get deployed, get deprecated, get replaced, but the data will remain. And so that's the natural place to put this, additional metadata information. Right? That's how it persists. And that's how you can get the maximum benefit. And that's how you get agility. If you move that data from one place, like, a very expensive MPP, you can move that to some other database, some warehouse, or some archival place somewhere in the cloud. It's still the same data set, and that metadata and that richness should follow along with that data as it moves. And data is always moving around because of either time or relevance or various other factors, and that metadata should not be lost. And that's really what we're trying to preserve. So that was a quick rundown. I hope that was not too fast and I didn't miss too many things there. But that's my last slide.
That's fascinating stuff. Dr. Bloor is waiting in the wings out there. I have some questions myself, but I'll hand it over to Dr. Bloor first. Take it away.
Okay. Well, the first thing, I like the way you finished. To be honest, Andrew, the first thing that comes to mind is I remember writing quite a long time ago. I mean, we're talking like a decade or so, maybe even a couple of decades. Data doesn't know what it is. And you're one of the few companies and one of the few people I've talked to that actually understands the truth of that and is trying to do something about it. Because, the solution, whatever there's a lot of complexity here in terms of what LLMs can and can't do and what you can and can't do with your corporate data. But the truth of the matter is, if you don't get the metadata straight, it's going to die. It's not going to happen. It just absolutely isn't going to happen. So the question is more about LLMs, and you've played with them far more than I have. So perhaps you can answer me some questions in this area. And the first one is the one that naturally arose for me out of listening to your presentation is: can you use LLMs to do the kind of mass classification that is going to be required when you point an LLM at the whole of, let's say, a large corporation's data? Does it do a lot of this work for you?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type and size of the data. I think industries that have deep data sets that are complex, I think the short answer simply is no at this point. The data is just too fast. When I was at the stock exchange, we were in 12 countries, 23 electronic market centers. Just the volume of data is just too high, right? To read all that data, would be a massive undertaking. The matching engines that are built today to process these things are very purposely built for this incredible performance, and they do very, very limited things. And to run that through some kind of generative AI engine of any sort would be a massive undertaking. So there is a mismatch in size. So there's got to be a shorthand to do it. And I think the only way to address that is really extracting metadata, the right metadata, and then pointing the Gen AI components to the metadata and not the original. And at a certain point, you can pick and choose bits of that original data that you want to analyze and go deeper. So you basically make it a two-stepper. The first step is kind of the landscape with metadata and then going deeper. Now, the metadata can have a sampling of data, but if you're dealing with 100 million rows, how big a sample can you really get that's representative? We did a lot of work around smart sampling. So we randomize sampling and do all this stuff, but unless you actually read all the data, you really don't know its shape, size, and proclivities until you actually read all of it. So we can guess, and so that's what we do. We guess, and then we kind of dig further and make a better guess. So I think that's the strategy that has to be used. It's not a magic wand yet. The GPU component, requirements are still pretty high. There's a lot of tooling out there in the cloud that allows you to have this abstraction layer, so you can call upon multiple GPUs or VMs that have NVIDIA A10s hiding behind the covers, but even small operations require several of them. And to do that at a massive scale, it just doesn't work out. Like, it's just not possible at this point. I think that'll change probably sooner than I suspect, but right now, I think that two-phased approach is the only way to go.
And real quick, Andrew, go back to one of your architectural slides just so we can look at that while you guys are talking.
Sure.
Go ahead, Robin.
So there's a number of broadcasts. We really don't have the time to go in to the level of depth that I would probably like to do, but there's two very general questions that I think are worth addressing, or at least having your opinion on. The first is the cost of all of this. An LLM is not like you've got yourself another spreadsheet on the desktop. An LLM is something that is hungry for money in one way or another. Whether you do it in cloud, whether you actually apply all the, let's say the economies that you can apply, you're still stuck with a very large bill. And what goes with this, in my mind, is the question of feasibility, opportunity. It's one of those things that, we used to do back in the day when we were engaging in a large project. You do a feasibility study, work out what you expected the benefits might be, and so on and so forth. And it occurred to me that with LLMs, first of all, you don't know what the benefits are because you don't know how it's going to behave when you throw it a question. It's not a predictable thing. And then there is the question. Everybody, of course, has got enthusiastic about this in the same way they got enthusiastic about data lakes. They made a mess with that. So my expectation is a lot of people are going to make a mess with this, in the sense of we paid a lot of money and we didn't get much. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think, those are perennial truths, Dr. Bloor, and it's often repeated over and over again. I think, hopefully we're a little smarter for this new hype phase. And, I think it is better. When we were talking about the data lake, we'll just solve the problems by dumping all the data in one place. And that's a great idea. And we're going to use this, this new technology. But data doesn't want to be in one place. It occurs and gets created in many places. And geographically speaking, it's not necessarily a good idea to force it and copy it and move it all to one central location, right? So there's a lot of kind of foundational assumptions that were just maybe not correct. Hopefully, we're not making the same types of mistakes with generative AI. I think the RAG model is really the way to go, right? And that's how we're going to solve the problems around the reliability, right? You have to have some kind of mile marker, benchmark for these responses, right? And if you can use the metadata, for instance, that is generated from your data, there is a much higher confidence that the results are going to be relevant and helpful and believable, right? That you can actually trust them because they're being derived from your data, right? So there's things where that doesn't apply. So if you're asking it to author a document or create an opinion, that might be one thing. But if you're asking it for comparisons, ETL type of operations, that is easier to do. And that is something that is doable. So the other part of my response is the RAG portion, obviously, but also specific use cases, right? If you know very specifically what that target is, the chance of hitting it is a little bit better than just having, all the things that it can do and trying to solve them all at the same time. So that really, it's also, I'm biased because that's kind of what my whole company is based on, really tight focus on a very specific use case, right? We want to handle, for instance, just a very limited set of semantic terms. So if we take a chord, which is an industry standard, we're only dealing with the subset, right? Property and casualty. What are we doing with it? Processing forms with it and making smart predictions about customers, right? So it's a very limited use case. So we can rip a lot of stuff out of that LLM and really make it a lot skinnier, right? And more performant. And in that way, we can only do certain things, right? You may not be able to rate college term papers, but boy, can it help you figure out, if the customer has a lot of claims, if maybe there's some suspicious activity, and maybe you want to send them a letter or send them, a different marketing campaign. So I think the scope, the depth is going to be key, and then the foundation has to be with RAG. There's no other way to do it.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that. Over the past few months, let's say actually the past year, really, it's been the Gen AI year in total. One of the things that just gradually became more and more apparent to me is two things are happening, not one. And the two things that are happening, the first one, which is not really your area of concern, is that the user interface is getting changed into being an interactive one. And pretty much every person out there that's got software is going to have an interface that's more chatty. And that's one of the things that everybody's really, really impressed that a Gen AI can do, and it's been able to do it from day one. It can have sensible conversations. And if you throw it questions about, oh, I'm using Excel, I'm not sure how to do this, just tell me, it does just tell you. And that's great. But that doesn't help you get at corporate data. And corporate data is the other place. And that's probably where the diamonds are buried. We don't know yet. It's a little too early to say, but it's probably going to be that, we had this rush a few years ago into machine learning and applying that kind of AI to data, and it discovered various patterns, some of which were very valuable to discover and so on. And Gen AI has already proved, for instance, in the area of spotting fraud in banking, that it can spot patterns, and it does it in an entirely different way to LLM machine learning, and it does it very well. So we know that it has a certain power to unearth patterns that you're not going to spot with machine learning. We know that, but what we don't know is how much of that it can do. So I'm kind of interested in, your opinion in terms of its potential in that area with the data. And I'm taking into account, because what you said, I think, is entirely true. You're going to have to do the categorization and get the metadata right. In order to get any kind of results that are trustworthy. I mean, I don't think it's just down to getting RAG working. I think it's down to, let's say, data scientists being able to look at the results of what's going on here and be able to say, yeah, I am very confident that it's found something.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I mean, that is the cornerstone of the scientific method, right? Reproducibility, right? Can other people reproduce those experiments and get the same results? And that is true for a lot of things. That is the proof. Without overdoing that whole the RAG component that we talked about before, that's going to be really critical. But one of the things that might be interesting that we haven't touched upon is there's a lot of regulatory regimes out there that most consumers could care less about, but are really important for enterprises. Things to deal with identity information, PII information, CCPA in Europe, GDPR. What would happen if your enterprise LLM knew about those rules? And you could ask it questions about the results. What are the GDPR implications, right? And it'll tell you this hits, Article 18 and 22 about identifiable information. And you know what? It looks like there's a minor with a criminal history in your data over there. Do something about it, right? And that's something that a general purpose LLM it doesn't even care about. It's not even on the radar, right? So those are the types of specificity, that type of thing that is going to be, that's really going to engender trust and reliability, right? And then being able to reproduce it, obviously, independently, right? being able to ask that question again and get the same results and verify it, right? There has to be that traceability. The traceability may not be so easy if you're using a service, a SaaS model in the public cloud somewhere. If it's in-house, however, that becomes much more transparent. You have all the logs, you have all the things that were asked when and how, and you can recreate that situation. And so that is that oversight, that compliance component is something that's also going to probably become more apparent. Right now, it's still very cumbersome. That's not an area that we're tackling, but I think that's going to also be a big one, right? And also the training of the language model. That's a little bit murky right now, especially for the larger public offerings. You know, because it's proprietary, they're purposely not showing that, right? But in an enterprise setting where you're building your own or modifying your own, that's something that needs to be tracked, surveilled, and audited, right? And that's something you can do if it's a bespoke, enterprise specific one. And I think to that end, I think the rise of all of these open standards, if not open source LLMs, are going to become more apparent. I think there's also going to probably be a consolidation. There's too many right now. It's going to be something like Linux. There's going to be many, but there's probably only going to be one or two that are actually used in the enterprise. And I think we're kind of headed towards that kind of a trend. And they will have different hallmarks at the end or further along. I think it'll have a much different complexion than the GPT solutions that are available to consumers, publicly facing today.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that. I mean, I think if you are, let's say, a large enough organization to have a budget to play with this stuff, I think you've still got a headache in determining which LLM to start with. I mean, I think that's an issue. I think there are other things. I mean, there's something you've touched on that I just want to amplify in the sense of my view of the world of data. Most data is an orphan because it doesn't know what its parents are. And until you actually get a data environment where every piece of data knows its parents, you're not going to solve what I would call the metadata problem writ large, which is knowing not just the meaning of the data, but the lifetime of the data. And I think I'm expecting that LLMs will, in one way or another, fix that, and in fixing it, they'll fix the governance problem, because that's part of the governance problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that one I have to maybe defer to you, Dr. Bloor, because I've been in this space for a little while and I haven't found a good solution for creating or being able to surveil for like lineage and proper data lifecycle. A lot of those things have to be ingrained in the DNA of the company to start that metadata and start that lineage from the beginning. So there has to be this notion of lineage and parentage kind of as a fundamental belief in the organization. And most companies, unfortunately, do not share that. To retroactively create lineage is guesswork. It's hard to do. So, I mean, I don't know how Gen AI is going to be able to do that. That's actually a very interesting problem. If that could be solved, it would be pretty fantastic. There are ways to do that. There are tricks to do that, but yeah, I haven't seen a good one yet. So I'd be very curious to see your, how that progresses and your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, it's a difficult. I mean, it is a difficult problem, and it's like if you point yourself at the problem and just use various kind of tricks of logic, you can often deduce where data must have come from. It's a kind of a logical pursuit, but it isn't necessarily anything that Gen AI is good at. That's not its strength.
I mean, yeah, it might be able to do that or at least tackle it in ways that traditional tools have not been able to. If you can look at the content and make sense of the content of two data elements that are smashed together for a typical ETL operation, if you only have the result of that, how do you figure out its parentage? Because it's not a superset of both. It's some kind of intersection, right? It's some kind of
Right.
weird join that they did with some filtering operation. So in order to do that, you have to figure out what the substance, the payload of the result is, and then think, oh, the constituent substantive, relevant, significant components were in parent A and parent B, right? And that's really hard. It might be hard for a human. It's probably going to be hard for any other tool. But GenAI can consume large amounts of data and can make sense of it, within reason, and based upon the results, perhaps come up with, its suggested, lineage. It is so that is a new tool that we can use.
So one of the things that comes up again and again in conversations, which I have with various people in this game, is the vector database. I just wanted your opinion on vector database. It's obviously the vector database vendors are absolutely insistent that you absolutely need this kind of database. But what's the practical reality of this, Andrew?
Oh goodness, I don't. I think it would be foolhardy to say I'm an expert in all databases and its performance profiles. Most databases have some benefits for certain applications, which is really kind of the reason why we have such a varied set or different types of them, right? For ease of bulk transactions, a vector database probably isn't the right way to go. A lot of people will store them in some kind of structured flat file and throw a SQL layer on top of it. Why? Because it's easy. You can move the data around. It can handle time series data. That may not be easy to do with a traditional database or a vector database. However, the flexibility of a vector database, or I don't know if you would lump that in with graph databases, is its ability to elaborate and to be able to handle changes in its structure really well and very efficiently. That is something that is great. But I don't know if that would be great for transactions. So that because it wouldn't benefit from those capabilities. So I think it would be good for maybe reference data, maybe good for a metadata layer. But I don't know if it would be great for just huge bulk transactions. That may not be the best use of it. So there might be different uses for vector databases, but I hope I'm not going off on the rails and that's not what you were talking about. So, do you have any thoughts on that yourself? It sounds like this is something that's close to you.
Well, I had a look at it. There are various situations where vector databases are just faster. So my thought was, it's a specialist database that if you need speed in a particular area and you may need it from GenAI, then you just throw a vector database in there. But there's, you see, when I started to look at it, I had this idea that you might not have one LLM. You might have several different LLNs in terms of where the training comes from. You let's say an insurance company. Well, you've got, let's say a general insurance company. So you insure cars, and you insure houses, and you insure people for their lives. You possibly need 3 different LLNs for those, trained in the different idiosyncrasies of those particular sets of data. So the question, and this is me being really in a sense naive, I'm not building anything, I'm just thinking about the issues. But in those situations, my idea was that you would have source data for the LLM and you would have separate training for the LLM, because it would probably be less expensive, but I don't actually know that.
Yeah, sorry, I mistook your question. As a replacement for LLMs, yeah, or as a supercharged performance enhancement for LLMs, I think absolutely that is a possibility. In fact, that's probably the ideal solution for that because of its flexibility. It is fast. The ability to pull together disparate sources and make those relationships would be very helpful. So, maybe not in an LLM that was like designed initially, but as we get to more of a RAG model, incorporating new elements to add that RAG component, that retrieval augmentation component, I would see those vector databases actually being quite helpful, right? Because you can pull together many different related elements for that, and that is something that would be quite efficient at. I think there's actually a couple of efforts. Probably the vector database folks are probably pitching that really hard, but I think they generally have something there. I think that is something that warrants exploration. It could really have the benefit of making it more flexible and actually quite performant.
Okay, so I just got one further question, which is, it's a general question, and it's for people in the audience, really, to have some guidance on this. If you take on these kinds of projects and you have the budget and so on and so forth, and you can find, actually another problem is finding people who are expert enough to build to this. But, you know, imagine that those things are solved. You're going to start out with a prototype, and my question really is, what would be the most sensible kind of area to look at, or what would be the rules in determining the first prototype to build for the LLM that is going to change your organization?
Oh, that's a great question. We are working on something with the property and casualty insurance space, which unfortunately I'm not going to go into great detail for, but you know, it's really coming up with a really tight use case, as we've talked about already many times, but coming up with a use case where the LLM provides a capability that just simply didn't exist before. And it'll be, you know, kind of clunky, maybe not so smooth, and it might make some errors. But I think we have the opportunity to create something that has a huge, brand new category, to be able to create something that that didn't exist before. And really, it won't be replacing people, the thing that we're working on anyway, but it's going to just make the knowledge worker much more powerful, and it will ultimately benefit end users and consumers better, right? So in terms of being able to greatly accelerate a claim, right? And, you know, it's not just an abstract thing about, oh, I'm going to file a claim for a car accident. It might be something like filing claims efficiently for your house that just was experiencing, you know, flooding. And it's not just one house, it's thousands or 10,000 homes. So speeding that up and doing it with a level of accuracy is not an academic exercise anymore, right? There might be FEMA money already available. So it's really just a problem of processing those things, right? And it can really impact lives, right? And the same would be for healthcare scenarios. So there are real life consequences for these things, and it's something that we'll be able to do in the future that we have not been able to do before. We can process these claims in hours instead of days or weeks. You know, at some point, because there are too many people in that, humans in that workflow doing maybe not the most efficient work, there's a maximum throughput, and that's just going to you know, expand greatly. So, you know, we can get knowledge workers to do more consequential work and really give them superpowers. And that's really, I think, the big breakthrough. There's going to be certain areas, I can't predict them all, but I think things like claims, that's a low-hanging fruit item, which I think are going to be transformed for basically any place that has a form and processing is going to get massively accelerated. And I think that's going to pay dividends in a lot of places.
Okay, Eric, I'll hand on to you because I'm sure you've got questions I didn't ask.
Yeah, you know, I mean, this is such a fascinating space. Andrew, how much control do you have as someone working with LLMs to adjust the architecture, if any? And where I'm going with that is, you know, you have these different RAG models that people are employing, and that's going to be a crucial component to ensuring integrity and in mitigating hallucinations and things of this nature. And does all that have to be done outside the LLM, or is it plausible to take, for example, the open source Llama version and actually tinker around with it yourself and change some settings in terms of where it points, what it looks at, these kinds of things? Can you get under the hood and actually play around with the engine itself?
I think the short answer is yes. And it's not just Llama. There's like a whole host of them, Mistral, Zephyr. We're actually working with Zephyr more now. But yeah, and you can roll your own eventually. It might be so, divergent. It might fork off of one of these things that it's going to be your own. And I think that is the key. Prior to starting the segment, I think the real one of these really cool byproducts of this new technology is going to be creating tools to modify that knowledge to make it smarter and making the technology bar lower, right? So subject matter experts, they may not be so great with programming tools or interfaces, can still capture their expertise and be able to have that be reflected in an LLM to be used, over and over again, right? So I think that initial pass is going to be painful. It's going to be arduous, but the benefits will be actually repeatable and, manifold. So getting that tooling right, reducing that friction, that cost of entry, I think is going to be kind of something that is going to be fun to watch, because I think that's going to really be the key to getting more specialized information into these LLMs. I think there'll be a whole crop of them in the not too distant future for specific use cases for specific industries, because they require specialized knowledge. It's not just, scanning the internet and profiling them, making good guesses. It's going to be people who really know about something, that really dig into it, that have those insights that are valuable, right? That's why we go to specialists. That's why we go to the dentist or the hospital and talk to a neurologist instead of just Googling internet for solutions sometimes.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And then, the other big question in my mind here is, if I'm a senior executive of a mid-sized company, even a large company, obviously we have to be careful about PII and things of this nature. I think there's a lot of work being done to be able to address that and at least flag things that have PII, flag things that are proprietary, for example, require additional governance, security clearances to get through to use these things. But the vision in my mind is, I want to point this thing at every bit of corporate data I have, and then as the executive, just ask it all kind of questions. How are we doing this quarter? Who can I fire? Who should I hire for this position? Which teams work best together? I mean, all of these things can be done now. And what I've found is, even on very abstract topics, I had it write a business plan for a concept I came up with a few years ago, and it brought up really interesting points that I did not put in the prompt that were absolutely relevant to the topic I was putting forth. So the power of these things is really very interesting at being able to reflect back what has already been known, what has already been published somewhere, somehow. But as a steward of an organization, it seems to me I'd want to connect it to everything and ask it any kind of question I want. But what do you think about that?
Oh, I think that's a great point. That's another reason to go with something inside of your firewall, right? You can get large language models, like, the Llama 2 7B is 7 billion, but they have like a bigger one that's like 40 billion, right? So you can get that, but then join that with your proprietary data that is not available on the internet, right? And in that way, you can ask those questions that are very specific, that are proprietary. That are not available anywhere else, right? But it's protected behind your firewall, and that's where we're going. That's what we need. So that combination is something that's specific to that company or that department, and those are the areas I think where I think it's actually going to have the most value. GenAI as a whole, as a generalized tool, is great. It's already useful, but the real power, the real diamonds are going to be there. in those specific use cases. When we give it the tooling, the foundation, that RAG foundation to give us those good results, and then let it go. Right? That's where we want to go.
And are you seeing, I mean, is it plausible to run one of these things inside your data center? So you have your team go and either, purchase or take an open source version, because to train these things is incredibly expensive. I mean, I know some of the companies that are working in that space right now, but is it plausible to have an on-prem LLM that you set up with your 500 machines, whatever the case may be? Is that genuinely doable, or is that just too complex or too expensive?
Yeah, I think, I mean, just like computing in general, I mean, you can have a virtual private set of, Gen AI tools with a bunch of, GPUs in an array that's abstracted. I mean, that's really what you get with a lot of these efforts through Azure and Snowflake and other places, right? So it is possible, but it's also possible to build it on bare metal as well. To do that kind of abstraction layer and having a farm of these that many users can use to build it from scratch yourself is probably not worth it. In terms of development, it is possible to stick, like the 7 billion Llama 2 model on a single NVIDIA A10 series GPU. So you can't do it for development. In terms of production, that's not viable. You just don't have the failover and the bandwidth and the throughput. So you'll have to go with some kind of, larger solution. But it is doable, and you can create a virtual private solution as well. So I think it'll be somewhere in between. The other kind of tantalizing component is if we can make the LLMs use case specific enough, maybe we can get it down from 7 billion to 1 billion, or maybe a couple of million, right? Because we don't need all of it, right?
Right.
And so it depends what you're using it for. And if it gets to a small enough place, we can use it, and then GPUs will get, of course, cheaper and better. There's going to be a time very soon where it's going to be, you can stick it on a commodity, virtual machine somewhere, right? Run it out of a Docker image. That's going to be probably one of these critical inflection points. Once we get there, it really will be everywhere. So when that happens, watch out.
Yeah, and then maybe just we'll go a little bit long here, but in terms of that ground truth concept, can you fine tune the engine itself to make sure that it's reaching into your trusted repositories for the facts that it services, such that you're using a large language model merely for its text generative capabilities and its understanding of syntax and so forth, but to ensure that the facts, which are the underpinnings of any statement or any report that you get on a business, can you make sure that it pulls those facts from your environment? And then, of course, as that example I gave, have citations to where it got all that stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was one of the first uses that I used ChatGPT for, citations. I mean, it scanned the internet. It probably can find more citations than I sure can. So yeah, if you have proprietary data, of course it can find citations. I think that's a really great use of it, actually, to bolster that. But it can be opinionated, and that's something that we need to guard against. I think its veracity, its fairness is something that we have to constantly work for. We need to have a division of processes. We need to build it into the tool itself, but we also need an external process, maybe another LLM, to just check on its compliance components. People still need to be in the loop to make sure that we're in compliance, but I think the tooling is there to accelerate that. It's not completely automatic, like it has never been, but we can get better, and we can use automatic tooling, and we can use Gen AI to do the other part too.
Yeah, and then maybe one more question here. In terms of the cost side of the equation, I think it gets very difficult to understand where, when, or how the other shoe might drop in this space. Like if you look at Facebook, and I'm sure you've heard this famous quote that what is it? If you're not paying for it, then you are the product, basically. So, Facebook is using all your text, all your images to build models to better understand who you are, who other people are, to do cohorts and then advertise better and all this stuff. So really understanding what it costs Facebook to run my Facebook page, that's a fairly difficult thing to ascertain. But in Silicon Valley, there's all this money that gets flooded into these companies, and some of them, of course, go away. But where I'm going with this is we kind of saw where the other shoe dropped with social media, at least in terms of the sort of censorship stuff that we saw the last couple of years, just strange behaviors. What might the other shoe dropping look like in this AI space, where these companies like Google and Anthropic, Amazon, they're not in business to lose money. They're in business to make money on this stuff. How will we know what's happening, or what do you think? What might the other shoe dropping look like in this space?
I don't have the perfect answer for you. In a recent survey from a seminar in a consortium I went to, indicated that most Fortune 500 companies are in a learning phase. There's a lot of money allocated, a huge amount of money in the industry, but they're not ready to buy yet. Most of them are on the learning phase. So they're doing programs. So I don't think the true cost is well known. One data point that we have is the cost for commercial solutions. If you want OpenAI solution, you know how much it's going to cost. If you want to use OpenAI and Azure, you know how much it's going to cost. What's unclear is how much it's going to cost to do a private or an open source element that you roll in your own shop. I think that's going to be the critical thing. Obviously, there are benefits that we just talked about in terms of compliance, control, reliability. But in terms of the absolute cost of doing this, it's unknown. I believe it will be less over time. If you were to look at a 3-year and a 5-year time frame, once you get to a functional solution to meet a specific use case, over time, obviously, it will be cost effective to have it in-house. Certain industries, however, that have a lot of data don't have the technical appetite for that. So that answer becomes a little muddled when you add consulting and some other things into it. Right. There'll be players that have kits that you can roll on your own that make this a lot easier. But I believe the cost will be lower in 3 years to 5 years for having your own, probably much sooner than that. The exact cost, not known right now.
Yeah, and then the last, I know I kind of lied, I guess, because I do have one more question. As I think about what's in the crosshairs of these systems, we mentioned customer service, we mentioned chat bots, we talked about frequently asked questions, these kinds of things. It's very, very powerful. It's going to save a ton of time. Those people are going to be able to do a lot of other things. What about business intelligence and traditional analytics, which has been driven by data warehousing, by data science to a certain extent? Is that stuff all in the crosshairs now? Because if I can take my existing data, load it into one of these models, and then ask it any number of questions, well, that's what I wanted to get from all that business intelligence stuff for all these years. And instead I get these big reports that I have to read through, and I get graphs and different things of this nature. It's never been as interactive as what we're now going to be able to do. So does that mean that all those BI vendors and analytics vendors, are they going to be subsumed by the Borg here?
I think it's like the proliferation of plastic. There's plastic in the deepest part of the ocean, and there's plastic in everybody right now. And I think the same will be true for Gen AI. Okay. It will be everywhere at some point, but to different degrees and different levels. Is it going to replace a report that you've been using forever for compliance? Answer, probably no. The reason why is the person receiving those compliance reports are expecting a very specific thing, and you probably don't want to rock the boat. In terms of BI to make business decisions, absolutely, because you want the most current, the most unfiltered set of possible options, absolutely. Somewhere in the middle, I think BI will also be impacted, because one of the things a lot of people don't think about, and I'm probably giving a little bit away here, is what happens if you run Gen AI to summarize and get interesting facts about structured data? Everybody talks about unstructured data, which is great. But what about structured data, right? You might be able to get quite a bit of insights there, especially if you have a lot of time series data, right? To be able to detect weak signals or small trends over many, many time series, that might be very interesting, right?
Yeah.
So suddenly these data sets that you had for years become much, much more valuable. So in terms of BI, it could be kind of a brightening effect, kind of resurgence, because now you know what new questions to ask. You can take those old tools that you always used, but ask it slightly different questions, or you can use GenAI entirely for those new types of insights. So I think this really is going to impact everything, but to different degrees. It's kind of a cop-out answer, but I think that's the way it's going to go. But I think those existing players, they're not going to go away, but they will be enhanced or they will be impacted somewhat.
Yeah. What a fascinating subject area, folks. Like we've said, this is a major inflection point. This is not just some minor evolutionary change. We are in the midst of a revolution. It's a computing revolution. It's going to be everywhere. It's already everywhere. It's already affecting things, and exactly how it all plays out, we will try to let you know for sure. That's what we do on these shows. So big thanks to Andrew Ahn from PraxyData and our very own Dr. Robin Bloor. We do archive all these webinars for later viewing. If you want to be on these shows, let me know. Send me an email to info@insideanalysis.com. And with that, we will bid you farewell, folks. We'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.